Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 298 and we're covering Gaudium et Spes 5-6. These paragraphs are on, we have so many new technological advances. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we spoke about the need to present the gospel anew after looking at the signs of the times, and then we talked about some of those signs. Today, we're going to continue the section, Introductory Statement of Men in the Modern World, and we're going to talk about how science has become the dominant form of knowledge in paragraph 5, and how migration has grown in paragraph 6. So paragraph 5 has 5 subparagraphs. We're going to read them in 2 parts. 5a and b talks about how the study has switched to the scientific, and that has changed culture. And then C3, human sciences have grown, and we are more interconnected, so there's now one human future rather than human futures of various cultures. So let's begin with 5a. A. Today's spiritual agitation and the changing conditions of life are part of a broader and deeper revolution. As a result of the latter, intellectual formation has ever increasingly based on mathematical and natural sciences, and on those dealing with man himself, while in the practical order of the technology, which stems from these sciences, takes on mounting importance. B. This scientific spirit has a new kind of impact on the cultural sphere and on modes of thought. Technology is now transforming the face of the earth and is already trying to master outer space. To a certain extent, the human intellect is also broadening its dominion over time, over the past by means of historical knowledge, over the future by the art of projecting and by planning. So these 2 subparagraphs talk about a new reality of life, and they start by mentioning how these new conditions make us think differently spiritually. We think about it differently, even on a practical level. For example, this semester I'm teaching a class where half of the class is on creation and evolution. And so we talk a lot about the science and biology and astrophysics and things like that when we want to talk about how we're going to talk about evolution and creation. But even more so in our mindset, we think, okay, we want everything that's measurable and scientific, and that can actually be negative in our spiritual life because the spiritual life doesn't operate on the same reality, on the same principles, in the same mode. The emphasis now is studying scientific fields and sometimes what we call human sciences like psychology, sociology, management, etc. Even today, when we look at university, what do people want? They want their kids to have a STEM degree. What is STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and management, or science, technology, engineering, and medicine. Those are the kind of fields people want their kids to go into. Why? Because those are the fields that society rewards. Who gets the big salary? Trust me, it's not me. I don't know any theologians who make a ton of money teaching in seminaries or teaching in colleges. We pay the bills, in the lay people do too, but it's not some kind of like high reward job. And this attitude changes our perception of the world. When we come from a world where the attitude is that the sciences, the technology, engineering is the best, well, then, we're going to have that kind of attitude to other things. Other things are lesser. But that's not true. What's most important for us as humans is our spiritual reality. It's noteworthy that the Council of Fathers mentioned we've mastered the world and now we want to master space. This would be right at the time of the Apollo missions. So John F. Kennedy set up the plan to land a man on the moon in 1961. It happened in 1969. This is published in 1965. So, talk of conquering the outer space is probably related to that. And we have this today, where today now they're talking about sending men to Mars or building a moon base where it's inhabited long-term, things like that. And at the same time, our knowledge is widening. We are able to build more in the future. We are spreading our knowledge. We are learning more about the past. We are learning more, and that's a good thing. So, moving on to paragraphs 5C through D, or subparagraphs, they talk about human sciences have grown, and we are more interconnected now as one human future. So let's read it. C. Advances in biology, psychology, and the social sciences not only bring men hope of improved self-knowledge in conjunction with technical methods that are helping men exert direct influence on the life of social groups. At the same time, the human race is giving steadily increasing thought to forecasting and regulating its own population growth. History itself speeds along on so rapid a course that an individual person can scarcely help keep abreast of it. The destiny of the human community has become all of a piece, where once the various groups of men had a kind of private history of their own. E. Thus, the human race has passed from rather static concept of reality to a more dynamic, evolutionary one. In consequence, there are arisen a new series of problems, a series as numerous as can be, calling for efforts of analysis and synthesis. So these subparagraphs start by talking about how we have more psychology, more human sciences. These can help us to know ourselves better. It's good to know that whether you're introverted, extroverted, other aspects of your life. And humans have now started to look at how we're going to control our future. There's a lot of things that are good in that. There's also the idea of regulating our growth, how many humans there are, and unfortunately outside the church, that often involves people sending contraceptives to developing nations to say, hey, have less kids. And men sometimes making foreign aid dependent on accepting those contraceptives. That is a problem. And that was really starting out back here 60 years ago. It is very much a problem today. The Council Fathers also note that history now is moving too fast for one person. And then in the last sentence of paragraph D and all of paragraph E here, they talk about how we are all united as mankind now. Before, there was a future for the Irish, a future for the Germans, a future for the Italians, a future for the Nigerians, a future for the Pakistanis, etc. That's not really the case now. Now, because we're all so interconnected, there is kind of a single future of all humanity. There is not these separate cultures. This creates a dynamic vision of culture, a dynamic vision of human future, and it creates a lot of new issues too, because obviously not everyone here is Christian. Certain people will have certain kind of totalitarian or unjust governments and things like that, and so we have to deal with that. That's going to be a challenge for us going forward in the next 50 years. So, moving on to paragraph 6. It has a whole bunch of subparagraphs, 6 in total. We're going to cover it in 2 parts. A through D is talking about how we have moved from being in small villages to cities to global interconnected webs. And then E and F are going to talk about migration. So, let's start right away with 6A. A. By this very circumstance, the traditional local communities such as families, clans, tribes, villages, various groups and associations stemming from social contracts, experience more thorough changes every day. B. The industrial type of society is gradually being spread, leading some nations to economic affluence, and radically transforming ideas and social conditions established for centuries. C. Likewise, the cult and pursuit of city living has grown, either because of a multiplication of cities and their inhabitants, or by a transplantation of city life to rural settings. D. New and more efficient media of social communication are contributing to knowledge of events. By setting off chain reactions, they are giving the swiftest and widest possible circulation to styles of thought and feeling. For us here in the 21st century, it might be hard to realize this, but for most human history, for the vast majority of human history, from when we're before writing hunter-gatherers living a nomadic lifestyle until the Industrial Revolution, human beings generally existed in small villages or clans of about 150. In these small villages, which would farm or which would fish or things like that. We only reached 50% of the population living in urban or suburban environments of the world population in the 2000s. I remember they estimated about now they're doing it. It was a news story a few years ago. This really started with industrialization because all of a sudden you need a whole bunch of workers in this factory. Then you need all the people who are making food and doing all the other things to provide for the people in the factory. That happens in any kind of situation where you have a big employer there. And I think Vatican II was kind of on the cusp of this kind of post-industrial world, this technological world, when it was written. I think there is still a lot with industrial world. We still have big factories making cars and things like that. But more and more, this is just being done by robots. And now we live in this technological, almost post-industrial world. Both the industrial and post-industrial world often see city living as the ideal. How often are your sitcoms, are your things, we're going to be from New York, not that we're going to be from some random town in the middle of the Midwest. And this is the idea. One of the things I kind of alluded to at the beginning of my description here is what's called the Dunbar number. So from various studies of history of villages, from psychological studies, from looking at primates, from other kinds of things, we note that about 150 is the natural size of a human community. And why 150? Well, with 150, we don't really need any police. Everyone knows everyone else. But we are kind of limited beyond that. We can't know, in the sense of really know and know the character of, 300, 400 people. There's a few exceptional individuals who can go 200, 250 and things like that. But on average, about 150 is all we can do. And so that has been the natural max size for a human community for millennia. So that's just a point there. Moving on to our second set of subparagraphs here, 6E and F, talking about migration or immigration. So let's read them. E. It is also noteworthy how many men are being induced to migrate on various counts and thereby changing their manner of life. Thus, a man's ties with his fellows are constantly being multiplied. And at the same time, socialization, in quotation marks, brings further ties, without help, however, always providing appropriate personal development and truly personal relationships. F. This kind of evolution can be seen more clearly in those nations which already enjoy the convenience of economic and technological progress. There is also a stir among people still striving for such progress, and eager to secure for themselves the advantage of an industrialized and urbanized society. These peoples, especially those among them who are attached to older traditions, are simultaneously undergoing a movement toward more mature and personal exercise of liberty. This is a reality we can see in the 20th century and the 21st century where we live, that there is more migration than there might have been historically. There wasn't the same kind of individual migration for economic reasons back in history. Now, I myself, as someone who grew up in Canada, who is now a dual citizen in the United States, am considered a migrant, although I was a migrant following my religious vocation, not for economic reasons. Had I stayed an engineer, I may or may not have for economic reasons, but it was ultimately more about my religious vocation than economics. But I have a lot of experience similar to those who go for economics because I went through a lot of the same processes. And this has a challenge that breaks social bonds. I no longer live near my parents. I'm not like a diocesan priest who can go and visit my parents every week, every few weeks, or every month. And this is a challenge because cities have these huge social networks, but oftentimes people can much easier fall through the cracks than they can in a village. And migration here, what the Council Fathers are talking about, is not necessarily international immigration. We also have a very strong migration in the United States, for example, from the north to the south in the past few decades, and from the rural areas to the urban areas. We see this sometimes in that we have a rural area where it used to support 3 parishes in these towns, and now we're reducing it to 1, not because the people in these towns necessarily are less Catholic, but because the population of these towns has gone down because people have moved to the cities. So this idea of migration also starts in the more developed, more industrialized societies, like I presume most of our listeners here, and then spreads to the less industrialized, less developed societies. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarCrest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarCrest Patreon. Tomorrow, we will continue with the next paragraphs of Gaudium et Spes. That will be paragraphs 7 to 8 on the contrast between progress and immoral actions. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X. For more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan. There is also an SQPN Discord with a channel for Vatican II in a Year at sqpn.com/Discord.
Amen.